In the years following the American Civil War, the western frontier became a place of both opportunity and dread. Vast stretches of unsettled land promised freedom, but they also concealed danger. The Osage Trail in Kansas was one of those paths, where settlers, traders, and travelers moved steadily toward the promise of a new life further west. It was along this trail, in the early 1870s, that a family known as the Benders appeared. To weary travelers, they seemed like just another group of immigrant settlers, carving out a livelihood in a harsh landscape. They built a modest cabin on the prairie, half home and half business, advertising meals, supplies, and a place to rest. On the surface, they were offering hospitality. In truth, the Benders were laying the groundwork for one of the most chilling stories in American frontier history. The family consisted of 4 members: John Bender, often referred to as Pa; his wife Elvira, known as Ma, their son; John Jr., and a young woman named Kate. But even these simple details begin to blur under scrutiny. It was common knowledge that their identities were uncertain, their origins murky, and the true nature of their relationships questionable. Some whispered that John Jr. and Kate were not brother and sister at all, but a couple passing themselves off as kin. Others suspected that the Benders might not even be blood relatives, but criminals thrown together by necessity. Their heavy German accents and strange behavior only deepened suspicion among their neighbors. When the family first arrived, they were not immediately remarkable. Many settlers in Kansas were immigrants, and many were rough in manner, unpolished in speech, and slow to mingle with others. The Benders built a small one-room cabin with a canvas curtain dividing the space in half. The front served as a store and kitchen, where travelers could purchase dry goods, supplies, or a hot meal. The rear was their living quarters. This simple arrangement gave them the appearance of respectability, hard-working settlers eking out survival in a dangerous land. But those who encountered the Benders often sensed that something was not right. Pa Bender was an older man, with little command of English. He was gruff and often avoided conversation altogether. Elvira, equally unfriendly, quickly earned a reputation among neighbors for her temper and hostility. They said she rarely smiled, rarely engaged with anyone outside the family, and had a stare that unsettled even the boldest men. John Jr., though younger, did little to ease suspicions. He had a bizarre, unsettling laugh that seemed to burst from him at odd moments, sometimes inappropriately. It became a local curiosity, part nervous tic, part sinister signal. But it was Kate, the younger woman, who stood apart. She was the face of charm in a family, otherwise cold and standoffish. Kate presented herself as a spiritualist, claiming she had the gift of communicating with the dead. In a time when spiritualism was gaining popularity across America, such claims were not unusual, and they attracted attention. She gave lectures in nearby towns, offered to heal the sick, and openly advocated ideas of free love and independence, radical beliefs for a woman in the 1870s. To some, Kate was fascinating and charismatic, a rare flame of intrigue on the dull prairie. To others, she was a dangerous woman, one whose ideas and aura of mystery signaled trouble. Despite their oddities, the Benders managed to establish themselves as a fixture along the Osage Trail. Travelers heading west often had few choices for rest and refreshment. Their inn, though modest, was a welcome sight after long days on the road. Those who stopped by might buy a meal prepared by Ma, talk briefly with Pa, endure the strange laughter of John Jr., and perhaps be charmed by Kate's striking presence. The Benders seemed like an eccentric family, nothing more. Yet, behind this outward normalcy, something darker was brewing. The Benders' cabin was not simply a home or a roadside stop. It was designed with intent. That canvas curtain, innocently dividing the living quarters from the business area, would prove central to their operation. Guests were typically seated with their backs to the curtain, a setup that allowed someone to move behind them without notice. In time, this arrangement would reveal itself to be far more sinister than practical. But in the early days, no one knew the trap they were walking into. Neighbors, though wary, were not quick to accuse. Suspicion in frontier towns was common, and life was often so harsh that people had little time to meddle in others' affairs. Settlers valued privacy, and the Benders were not the only strange family carving out survival on the plains. Still, their reputation as unfriendly, secretive, and unusual grew steadily. Stories circulated about Kate's eerie predictions, about John Jr.'s laughter, about the sharp glare of Elvira. Rumors alone, however, were not enough to raise alarms. The truth was that the Benders' presence filled a void along the trail. To travelers, they were simply another place to stop for rest in a vast and unforgiving wilderness. For locals, they were neighbors to be tolerated, even if they inspired unease. What no one realized was that beneath the facade of weary immigrants lay a murderous intent. The Benders had created a stage perfectly set for their crimes. An isolated cabin on a lonely trail, a family that could play their roles convincingly, and a steady stream of strangers who would not be missed until it was far too late. And so, with their arrival in Kansas, the pieces were set in place for a story of deception, violence, and fear that would one day haunt the nation. The Benders, whether true kin or conspirators bound by darker ties, had embedded themselves into the fabric of frontier life. They looked like settlers. They acted, at least on the surface, like innkeepers. But the truth of their arrival was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. And soon the lonely prairie would begin to give up its secrets. This was only the beginning of what would become one of the most infamous and macabre chapters in American frontier history. When travelers stepped inside the Bender cabin along the Osage Trail, they were met with a humble but oddly arranged space. To the untrained eye, it was simply another prairie dwelling, a one-room building built of rough lumber patched against the wind. The air carried the smells of smoke, stew, and earth. A counter displayed dry goods and basic supplies for sale, giving the impression that the family was running a modest frontier store. At first glance, it seemed no different from other homesteads that dotted the Kansas landscape. Yet, if one looked closely, there was something peculiar in the way the Benders had constructed their little business. The most striking feature was the large canvas curtain that hung across the middle of the room, dividing the front where travelers ate and shopped from the rear where the family slept. For a weary traveler, the curtain was nothing more than a mark of privacy. But for the Benders, it was a tool, and for their guests, it would soon become part of a trap. Seating in the inn was arranged with unsettling consistency. Visitors were guided to sit at a place of honor near the curtain, their backs turned toward it. This seat, which seemed at first like a spot chosen for hospitality, was in fact the most dangerous position in the room. From behind the curtain, someone could move silently into place, standing just a few feet from the unsuspecting guest. At the table, conversation flowed, Kate with her charm and her curious talk of spirits, Ma with her harsh glances, John Jr. with his strange laugh, and Pa with his minimal, broken English. A hot meal was served, often bread, meat, and stew. Yet, while a guest lifted a spoon or leaned forward to listen, there was another presence, hidden in the shadows behind the canvas, waiting. The family's method was both simple and horrifying. While the victims sat with their back turned, one of the Benders would position themselves silently behind the curtain. Then came the blow, a hammer, swung with precision and force to the back of the head. The victim, struck in an instant of trust and vulnerability, would collapse forward, often stunned or unconscious. Before there was time to recover, another member of the family acted swiftly, cutting the throat to ensure death. The method was brutal but efficient. honed by repetition and carried out with a coldness that suggested careful planning rather than impulse. The design of the cabin served the bender's purpose well. The earthen floor contained a trapdoor leading to a small cellar beneath the building. After a victim was struck and silenced, the body was lowered through this opening into the dirt below. The cellar floor, witnesses later said, was drenched with blood, the earth so saturated that even after cleaning, the stains could not be erased. For the benders, this grim storage space was temporary. Under cover of darkness, the bodies were dragged outside and buried in shallow graves in the orchard, a field of trees that became both their livelihood and their cemetery. What is most chilling about this setup is how ordinary it must have seemed to those who first walked in. A tired traveler, perhaps a farmer moving west with hopes of land, or a merchant carrying money to the next town, would never have guessed that the very design of the inn had been crafted with murder in mind. The canvas curtain, the seating arrangement, the easy charm of Kate, it was all theater, a stage carefully prepared so the family could play their roles. Each member had a part. Pa and Ma supplied the stern, hard-working image. John Jr. offered distraction with his unsettling humor. Kate, with her beauty and bold manner, lured men into conversation and lowered their defenses. Together, they became the perfect cast for their gruesome play. Neighbors and passers-by, who later recalled their visits to the Bender place, often mentioned the unease they felt. Some said the cabin felt too closed, too secretive, the curtain giving off a sense that things were happening just out of sight. Others remarked that Kate's charm was offset by something darker in her family's demeanor, a sense that she was the friendly face masking something colder behind her. Still, these were impressions, not evidence. On the frontier, people were strange in many ways, and oddities were tolerated. No one could have imagined that the Bender's odd design was in fact a killing chamber. The grim efficiency of the murder setup suggests something more than random violence. It implies practice, a pattern that repeated itself over and over. The victims were chosen not by chance, but by calculation. The Benders often targeted men traveling alone, men who might carry cash or supplies, but whose disappearance would not immediately draw suspicion. Families and large groups were less likely to vanish into the curtain, but lone wanderers, traders, or small parties became easy prey. After their death, their possessions were stripped: money, goods, even wagons. What could be sold was kept. What could not was abandoned. It was robbery intertwined with ritual, a business of death hidden behind the guise of hospitality. It is worth remembering that the Benders operated in a time and place where law and order were thin, where news traveled slowly, and where people vanished on the frontier with alarming regularity. Roads were treacherous, weather unforgiving, and bandits or native raids were often blamed for disappearances. The Benders took advantage of this uncertainty. Each missing traveler could be explained away as the victim of distance, weather, or chance. Their inn provided them with a steady stream of opportunities, and their gruesome efficiency allowed them to maintain their facade. The trap, the hammer, the cellar, all of it together, paints a picture of premeditation that chills even now. It was not a crime of passion, nor a single moment of madness. It was a system, a machinery of death built into the very walls of their home. To sit at the Benders' table was to unknowingly step onto a stage where one's role had already been written, where hospitality was a mask and the curtain was the edge of a nightmare. And while the prairie winds blew over the plains outside, while travelers shared meals and stories inside, behind the canvas curtain death was always waiting, patient and certain. As time passed and more people traveled the Osage Trail, whispers began to rise among the settlers and townsfolk who lived nearby. The trail was busy, and though it was not unusual for travelers to vanish in the harsh, uncertain conditions of the frontier, the number of disappearances began to trouble even the most hardened pioneers. Men who had been expected to arrive in towns to the east or west never showed up. Families who awaited letters from their relatives on the road received only silence. Horses were found wandering without riders, wagons were abandoned along the trail, and money or belongings seemed to evaporate into thin air. At first, people explained these vanishings the way they always had, by blaming outlaws or raids, or assuming that bad weather or illness had claimed the travelers before they could complete their journeys. But as the list of missing grew, unease turned to suspicion. Among those who vanished were men of standing, respected in their communities, and this was what began to turn local murmurs into serious concern. Dr. William York was one of the most notable cases. He was a physician and the brother of a Kansas state senator, making him a man whose disappearance could not be ignored or explained away. He had been last seen traveling along the Osage Trail, and then he was gone. His horse returned without him, wandering back toward familiar ground, but the doctor himself had simply vanished. His disappearance, layered on top of the growing list of others who had gone missing in the same stretch of prairie, set off a ripple of alarm that spread far beyond the immediate area. Before York, there had been others whose vanishings, though noticed, did not carry the same weight of consequence. Farmers on their way to settle new land, traders moving between towns, and solitary wanderers all failed to arrive at their destinations. In the open expanse of Kansas, such losses were mourned but rarely investigated. The prairie itself was dangerous, and the frontier did not always allow the luxury of searching for every missing soul. Yet, as neighbors began to recall patterns travelers who stopped near the same stretch of road, men who mentioned staying the night at the Benders' place before disappearing, an uneasy picture began to form. Still, suspicion was fragile. The frontier was filled with dangers, and coincidences were easy to claim. Many locals were reluctant to accuse their neighbors, especially those who appeared to be hard-working settlers trying to survive like everyone else. The Benders, for all their strangeness, had not openly broken any laws. Their inn was a place people knew, and although some admitted later that they felt uncomfortable there, no one had seen a crime committed. Rumors spread, but without proof. They were little more than campfire stories. The Benders themselves seemed untouched by the growing unease. They continued to welcome travelers, continued to serve meals, and continued their peculiar routines. Kate still offered spiritual services, drawing in those curious about her claims of speaking with the dead. John Jr. still let out his unsettling laugh, unnerving the guests who stopped at their table. Pa and Ma, silent and harsh, remained in the background. The curtain still divided the cabin, and men still sat with their backs to it, unaware of what fate might await them. The prairie community, meanwhile, was caught between fear and uncertainty. Each new disappearance chipped away at the explanations people leaned on. Could so many men really have fallen prey to bad luck? Could bandits strike so often in the same place without leaving a trace? Some neighbors began to whisper more openly that perhaps something was happening near the Benders' Inn, something darker than anyone wanted to believe. Yet fear, distance, and the rough demands of frontier life meant that suspicion remained unacted upon. The families of the missing, however, could not let the matter rest. When Dr. York vanished, his brothers, one a colonel and the other a senator, pressed the issue harder than anyone had before. They organized search parties, interviewed locals, and retraced the paths of the missing. Their investigations inevitably circled back toward the Benders. Neighbors recalled seeing York ride in that direction. Others admitted that they too had noticed that the number of men vanishing seemed to connect somehow to that isolated little cabin on the trail. These recollections, once set aside as baseless, began to take on sharper edges. In hindsight, it is chilling to imagine the guests who had been fortunate enough to leave the inn alive. Perhaps they had not been chosen, or perhaps the family did not see enough profit in killing them. Some travelers later recounted feelings of dread, of sensing that the family was watching them with something more than simple curiosity. The laughter, the stares, the strange insistence on where to sit at the table, it all seemed more sinister when looked back upon. For those who survived, memory became a haunting recognition of just how close they may have come to joining the list of the disappeared. The growing fear of vanishings marked the slow unraveling of the Benders' carefully maintained facade. Their business relied on the steady stream of travelers, but each victim left behind unanswered questions, grieving relatives, and unsettled neighbors. With Dr. York's disappearance in particular, the fragile web of silence that had shielded the Benders from suspicion began to tear. The community could no longer dismiss the pattern as chance, and the missing were no longer faceless strangers whose fates could be left to speculation. The prairie, vast and unforgiving, had hidden the truth of the Benders' crimes for years. The inn had stood as a place of rest, a stop on the long road west, while beneath its floor and in the nearby orchard lay the evidence of a horror no one wanted to imagine. The disappearances were not accidents of fate, not the random cruelties of weather or misfortune. They were deliberate acts, carried out again and again behind the curtain of that quiet little cabin, until the number of missing could no longer be ignored. And as the community's unease gave way to certainty, the mask the Benders had worn began to slip, setting the stage for the grisly discoveries that would soon come to light. The spring of 1873 brought with it a breaking point. For years, the vanishings along the Osage Trail had been tolerated as part of the perilous life on the frontier, but the disappearance of Dr. William York had pressed the matter beyond neglect. His brothers, one a colonel and the other a state senator, would not allow his fate to be explained away as bad luck or misfortune. They demanded answers. Search parties were organized, and neighbors who had long harbored suspicions began to speak more openly. The Benders' Inn, once a strange but tolerated outpost, soon stood at the center of mounting suspicion. When local men finally rode out to confront the family, they found the cabin abandoned. The Benders were gone, leaving behind only their belongings, their animals, and a silence that felt heavier than any storm. That silence demanded investigation, and what the searchers uncovered would horrify not just the local community, but the nation. When men from nearby settlements entered the Bender cabin, they were struck by its eerie stillness. Food and supplies were left behind as though the family had departed in haste. The animals, still penned, were unfed and suffering, a sure sign that no one had tended them for days. The canvas curtain still hung across the room, a mute reminder of the place where so many had unknowingly taken their final seat. Suspicion quickly turned into grim certainty when the searchers lifted the trapdoor in the floor. The stench of decay rose up, thick and undeniable. The cellar beneath the cabin was soaked in blood. The earthen floor had been hacked at, churned by countless stains, as though the ground itself had swallowed death again and again. The men knew immediately what they were dealing with, and word spread like wildfire. The cabin was not simply an inn. It was a slaughterhouse. The search did not stop with the cellar. Outside, on the property where the Benders had tended their orchard, men began to probe the soil. They did not have to search long. The first body unearthed was that of Dr. William York, the very man whose disappearance had drawn so much attention. His throat had been cut, and his skull bore the mark of a hammer's crushing blow. Nearby, more shallow graves revealed themselves, each one containing the remains of another missing traveler. The orchard, once a symbol of growth and promise, was revealed as a graveyard. Men dug with fury, uncovering one body after another. The corpses were in varying stages of decay, but the signs of their deaths were all strikingly similar. The hammer had done its work, and the knife had finished it. By the time the search was done, at least a dozen bodies had been recovered. Though some claimed there were far more, their final resting places never found. Children were discovered among the victims as well, adding another layer of horror to the tale. These were not simply robberies carried out against lone men with money in their pockets. The Benders had murdered indiscriminately, claiming whoever they thought they could overpower or exploit. For those who witnessed the exhumations, the memory never faded. The orchard became a place of dread, the soil itself tainted with the stench of cruelty. Men who had once shaken their heads at rumors now stood over open graves, confronted with the undeniable evidence of what had happened in their midst. The Benders had not been eccentric neighbors, nor simply unfriendly immigrants. They had been killers operating in plain sight, taking advantage of the isolation and the trust of the frontier. Their inn had been nothing more than a carefully constructed trap. The discovery sent shockwaves through Kansas and beyond. Newspapers seized upon the story, spreading tales of the bloody Benders across the nation. In an age when the West was both feared and romanticized, the account of a family of killers preying on travelers seemed almost too ghastly to be true. Yet the evidence could not be denied. The cabin with its blood-soaked cellar, the orchard filled with shallow graves, the missing men whose remains had finally been accounted for. All of it painted a picture too vivid to be dismissed as folklore. Neighbors, who had long harbored unease about the family, found their suspicions justified in the most terrible way. They remembered Kate's bold eyes and strange promises, John Jr.'s laughter, Ma's cold stare, and Pa's silence. These quirks, once dismissed as oddities of character, now seemed like glimpses into something much darker. The curtain that had divided the cabin was no longer a symbol of privacy, but of death, a boundary between life at the table and violence in the shadows. The horror of the discovery was sharpened by the fact that the Benders were gone. The family had fled before the community descended upon them. They had left behind their home, their tools, their livestock, and their victims, but not themselves. No one could say for certain where they had gone or how far they had managed to travel. Their absence turned outrage into frenzy. Rewards were offered, posses were formed, and manhunts stretched across counties and states. Yet, despite the intensity of the search, the Benders seemed to vanish into the very wilderness that had once sheltered their crimes. Rumors sprang up that they had been captured and lynched in secret, that vigilantes had taken justice into their own hands, or that they had slipped away under false names and melted into new communities far from Kansas. None of these stories were ever confirmed. The Benders, it seemed, had disappeared as suddenly as their victims had, leaving behind only questions and fear. For the community, the orchard and the cabin remained a scar. The physical evidence of the murders lingered long after the family had fled. The blood-stained cellar, the graves among the trees, the scattered belongings of the dead all became grim reminders of how easily evil could nestle itself within the ordinary. Visitors came from miles around to see the sight, some out of horror, others out of morbid curiosity. Over time, the cabin itself was dismantled, but the story never faded. It became part of the folklore of the American West, a tale retold around fires and in newspapers, each telling layering the horror with myth. Yet beneath all the exaggerations and rumors, the truth of the grim discovery remained clear. A family, hidden in plain sight, had turned their home into a killing ground. They had exploited the vulnerabilities of travelers, the isolation of the prairie, and the trust of strangers. Their orchard, once a place of life, had been filled with the dead. And though their crimes were exposed, the Benders themselves never faced the justice of a court or a noose. The grisly discovery at the Bender property was more than the revelation of a crime. It was the shattering of illusions. It reminded the frontier communities that not all dangers came from the wilderness, the weather, or distant raiders. Sometimes the deadliest threat came from those who smiled at your arrival, offered you food, and waited for you to turn your back. When the truth of the orchard came to light, the first instinct of the community was rage. The shallow graves had given them more than answers. They had given them nightmares that no one could wash away. Men who had once shared meals with the Benders now realized they had been in the presence of killers, and neighbors who had dismissed their unease as harmless eccentricity now carried guilt for not speaking sooner. Yet, as the dead were buried again with proper rites, another grim question loomed over the prairie. Where had the Benders gone? The cabin was empty, the livestock left to starve, the hearth cold. The killers had fled, but to where? No one could say. This absence was perhaps the cruelest part of the story, for while the bodies of the victims had been found, justice for them seemed to slip further. Away each day the family remained at large. The last confirmed sighting of the Benders came shortly, before their cabin was searched. Some neighbors reported seeing the family's wagon leaving the property, drawn by a team of starving horses. They seemed to be traveling together, though rumors suggested they might have split once out of sight. From that point onward, the trail grew cold. The open prairie, the dense woods, and the countless roads heading in every direction provided cover enough for a family desperate to disappear. Search parties fanned out across Kansas and into neighboring states. Posse riders carried descriptions of the family: Pa, with his heavy accent, Ma with her scowling face, John Jr. with his awkward laugh, and Kate with her striking presence. Notices went out in newspapers, rewards were posted, and rumors began to swirl in every town they passed through. Some claimed the Benders had been caught within weeks of fleeing, strung up by vigilantes, unwilling to wait for the slow wheels of justice. These stories told of secret hangings and unmarked graves where the killers themselves had been buried. Others swore that Kate and John Jr. had been seen together in different towns, posing as man and wife, moving quietly from one community to the next under false names. Still others believed Ma and Pa had separated from the younger pair, vanishing into distant settlements where their heavy accents and silence would not seem unusual among immigrant families. Each tale carried a seed of plausibility, but none were ever proven. The state of Kansas offered substantial rewards for their capture, and the federal government was even pressured to intervene. Posters with the words "Wanted, the Bloody Benders" appeared in towns across the Midwest. Posses rode as far as Texas and Colorado in pursuit of leads, and sheriffs from Missouri to Nebraska reported chasing after families that matched the descriptions. Yet each time, the trail went cold, leaving behind only frustration. In an era without centralized records, without telegraphs reaching every small town, and without photographs widely circulated, a family could easily vanish into the tide of settlers moving west. The Benders had chosen their time well, for the frontier was a place where new identities could be created with little more than a name and a story. This uncertainty only deepened the terror surrounding their legend. It was one thing to uncover the graves and know that the killers had been caught and punished. It was another to know that they might still be out there, blending into the crowds, living under new names, and perhaps even continuing their crimes. Parents warned their children about strangers. Women whispered about Kate's supposed powers, and men spoke in low tones about the possibility of the Benders showing up again when least expected. The family's absence became its own form of haunting, one that lingered in the imagination long after the orchard had been cleared. Over the years, alleged sightings and captures continued to surface. Newspapers reported with excitement whenever a woman matching Kate's description was found, often tied to criminal activity or claims of spiritualism. In some cases, women were arrested and put on trial, only for the evidence to crumble under scrutiny. John Jr. was reportedly spotted in Texas, in New Mexico, even in Canada, But none of these reports could be confirmed. The truth was that the Benders had become more myth than reality, their story swelling with each retelling. They were no longer just a family of killers. They had become a symbol of the dangers hidden in the vast openness of the frontier. For the families of the victims, the lack of closure was unbearable. They had graves to visit, but they had no justice to claim. Every rumor of a capture raised their hopes, only to dash them again when proven false. The York family, in particular, remained outspoken, determined to see their brother's killers brought to account. Yet time wore down even the most fervent hunters. The years passed, and still the Benders remained shadows, their fate unknown, their crimes unanswered. The possibility that they were never caught remains one of the darkest aspects of the tale. It suggests that they may have lived out their lives under false names, perhaps continuing their murderous ways in places where no one thought to connect them to a Kansas orchard. It also suggests that they could have blended so deeply into other communities that they became ordinary settlers, their past hidden forever. This uncertainty has allowed the legend of the Bloody Benders to persist far beyond the 19th century. They remain figures of fascination precisely because their story lacks an ending. What gives the mystery its enduring power is not just the horror of their crimes, but the way they slipped away from justice. For every other notorious killer of the era, there is an end to capture, a trial, an execution. With the Benders, there is only silence. Their cabin was torn down, their land abandoned, their orchard left to the elements. But their names remained, repeated in newspapers, whispered in towns, written in the histories of Kansas. They became, in some ways, larger in their absence than they had been in their presence. Their vanishing left a wound that could not close. The escape of the Benders is a reminder of the fragility of order in the frontier. In a world still shaping itself, where law traveled slower than men on horseback, where settlements could vanish. Under storms or raids, justice was as fragile as a campfire in the wind. The Benders exploited that fragility. They built a stage for murder, played their roles with cold precision, and when discovery came too close, they simply walked away. Their victims were left behind, their neighbors were left with guilt, and the law was left with nothing but rumors that the orchard had given up its dead. But the prairie never gave up the family who had planted them there. The story of the Bloody Benders did not end with the discovery of their victims, nor with their escape into the wilderness. In fact, what has allowed their tale to endure in American memory is precisely the way it lingers unfinished, feeding both horror and imagination. With every body exhumed from the orchard, the legend grew, and with every failed attempt to capture the family, that legend hardened into something larger than history itself. What the Benders left behind was more than a series of murders. They left behind a legacy of fear that transformed them into symbols of the darker side of the American frontier. For people living in Kansas at the time, the realization that such horror had taken place in their own community was devastating. Until then, the dangers of the frontier had always been understood to come from the wilderness, the unpredictable weather, the scarcity of resources, or, as many settlers believed, the possibility of raids by native tribes. But the Benders turned that fear inward. They showed that the greatest threat might not be in the storms or the lonely roads, but in the neighbors who waved as you passed, in the house where you stopped for supper, or in the smile of a young woman who offered you warmth in an unfamiliar place. Their crimes forced communities to confront the possibility that evil could live quietly among them, hiding behind curtains and waiting for the right moment to strike. This realization was not something easily shaken. Long after the orchard had been dug up and the bodies reburied, stories about the Benders continued to circulate. Travelers passing through Kansas would be told to beware of isolated inns, their hosts warning them with wide-eyed whispers about the family that vanished. Parents told their children never to trust strangers too quickly, invoking the Benders as a cautionary tale. Even neighbors who had once dined in the Bender cabin could not rid themselves of the image of what had taken place there, of how close they themselves might have come to death. The story worked its way into the psyche of the frontier, a reminder. That danger was not always visible until it was too late. As the years passed, the Benders became fixtures of folklore. Newspapers, eager to thrill readers, embellished the story with lurid details. They described Kate as a seductress who used her beauty and supposed spiritual gifts to lure men to their deaths. They portrayed Ma as a witch-like figure whose cruelty knew no bounds. John Jr. was remembered for his grotesque laugh, and Pa for his cold silence, both of which seemed, in hindsight, to have been the signals of their monstrous intent. These depictions, though exaggerated, cemented the Benders as almost mythic. Villains, characters who embodied both the fascination and the fear of the Wild West. The mystery of their fate only deepened this mythology. Had they been caught and lynched by a mob in secret, as some claimed? Had they split up and melted into new communities under false names? Were they still alive decades later, perhaps committing new crimes in towns that never knew their past? A lack of resolution allowed imaginations to run wild. Each rumor added to their legend. Each unconfirmed sighting gave rise to new stories. They became not only a part of Kansas history, but also a recurring figure in American ghost tales, pulp novels, and eventually, even film and television. The psychological grip of the Benders' crimes went beyond simple fascination. Their story struck at something primal, the betrayal of trust in the most intimate setting. An inn was supposed to be a place of refuge, a pause in the dangerous journey of the trail. To know that this place of safety had instead been turned into a killing ground was to destabilize the fragile sense of security people clung to on the frontier. It was not just the murders themselves, but the methodical way in which they were carried out that left people shaken. The curtain, the hammer, the trapdoor, the cellar, these elements formed a ritual of death that transformed the family into something larger than human criminals. They became the embodiment of calculated, everyday evil. Over time, the tale of the Bloody Benders began to serve as a symbolic story about the frontier itself. For some, it was a warning about the cost of unchecked lawlessness, a reminder of why communities needed strong systems of justice and order. For others, it was a testament to the brutality that could lurk in the human heart, a darkness that no sheriff or judge could ever fully banish. The frontier, often painted in romantic colors as a land of freedom and opportunity, had its shadows, and the Benders became one of the darkest of those shadows. Even today, more than a century later, the Benders remain a source of fascination. Their story is told in history books, true crime accounts, podcasts, and documentaries. Tourists visit the region in hopes of finding traces of their homestead, though nothing of the original cabin remains. Historians argue over the details, how many victims there truly were, whether the family were actually related, and what ultimately became of them after their flight. Fiction writers borrow their tale to craft stories that blend history with horror. They endure because they represent not only a shocking chapter of crime, but also a mystery that will never be solved. The legacy of the Bloody Benders is not simply about their killings, though the brutality of their methods ensured they would never be forgotten. It is about the way they slipped into the fabric of the frontier, wearing the masks of ordinary settlers, and how they revealed the fragility of trust in a world where survival depended on strangers extending kindness. Their crimes left scars, not just on the land of Kansas, but on the imagination of a nation. They were proof that even in the open prairie, with its vast horizons and endless skies, darkness could bloom in the most ordinary of places. And so, the Bloody Benders remain, not as flesh and blood, but as shadows carried forward in story and memory. their name forever tied to the haunting truth that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who smile across the table.